the dancing plague of 1518, when a city danced to death. In the sweltering summer of 1518, the city of Strasbourg witnessed one of history's most bizarre and terrifying phenomena. It began with a single woman stepping into the street and dancing wildly, without music, without reason. Within days, dozens joined her. Within a month, hundreds were dancing uncontrollably through the streets and squares of the city. They danced until they collapsed from exhaustion. They danced until their feet were bloody. Some danced until they died. This wasn't a celebration or a festival. It was a mysterious affliction that gripped an entire city in a frenzy of unstoppable movement. Welcome to the story of the dancing plague of 1518, one of history's most perplexing and haunting episodes. A tale where reality seems stranger than fiction, where hundreds of people were seized by an irresistible urge to dance, many until their final breath. What could cause such a phenomenon? What does it tell us about the human mind and the society of the time? Join us as we step back into 16th century Strasbourg and unravel the mystery of the dancers who couldn't stop. Setting and context: Strasbourg in 1518. To understand the dancing plague, we must first understand Strasbourg in 1518. This was a prosperous imperial free city within the Holy Roman Empire, now located in modern-day France. With its magnificent cathedral and position along vital trade routes, Strasbourg was an important religious and commercial center. But beneath this prosperity lay a population under immense strain. The early 16th century was a time of extraordinary hardship for the common people of Strasbourg. The region had suffered terribly from a series of misfortunes that left many in desperate circumstances. Famine had ravaged the area for several years. Crops had failed repeatedly due to unusually cold and wet weather, part of what historians now call the Little Ice Age. Grain prices had soared to unprecedented heights, making bread, the staple food, unaffordable for many. Malnutrition was rampant. Disease followed hunger, as it often does in history. Syphilis had recently arrived in Europe and was cutting a deadly path through the population. Smallpox and leprosy were constant threats. The mortality rate was staggering, especially among children. Adding to these physical hardships was the psychological burden of living in a society saturated with superstition and religious anxiety. This was a world where people genuinely believed in the constant intervention of supernatural forces, both divine and demonic, in daily life. Saints could protect you, but devils could possess you. Heaven awaited the virtuous, but hell gaped open for sinners. The Church taught that disasters like famine and plague were divine punishments for human sin. Many lived in constant fear of God's wrath and the devil's temptations. It was in this atmosphere of physical suffering and psychological distress that the dancing plague erupted. The people of Strasbourg were primed for crisis, their bodies weakened by hunger, their minds troubled by fear. What happened next would test the limits of human endurance and baffle authorities for centuries to come. The outbreak: Frau Trophia's first dance. It began on a scorching day in July 1518. A woman known to history only as Frau Trophia stepped into the narrow streets of Strasbourg and began to dance. There was no music playing. No festival or celebration was taking place. Yet she danced with wild, frenzied movements, twisting, twirling, and leaping. Hour after hour she continued, her face showing no joy but rather a kind of pained trance. Neighbors gathered to watch the strange spectacle. Some laughed at first, thinking it a jest or perhaps the actions of a madwoman. But as the day wore on and Frau Trophia continued her relentless dancing, amusement turned to concern. Night fell, but still she danced. Her feet became bloodied, her clothes soaked with sweat, yet she could not or would not stop. Eventually, she collapsed from exhaustion, only to rise again and resume her bizarre dance once she had rested. This continued for nearly a week, dancing until exhaustion, brief rest, then dancing again. The city authorities were baffled. Her husband pleaded with her to stop. Nothing worked. Local physicians were consulted. They diagnosed Frau Trophia with hot blood, a condition believed at the time to cause strange behaviors. The recommended treatment was more dancing, to let the excess energy work itself out of her system. It was a decision that would have catastrophic consequences. The city council, following this medical advice, took extraordinary measures. They cleared market spaces, hired professional musicians, and even constructed a wooden stage. Their hope was that by providing a dedicated space and music for the afflicted woman, her condition would resolve itself. But instead of curing Frau Trophia, these actions seemed to spread the mysterious affliction. Within days, more than 30 people had joined her, dancing day and night without rest. By August, the number had grown to 400. Men, women, and children, people from all walks of life, were seized by the same irresistible urge to dance. The dancing plague had begun in earnest, and Strasbourg was about to witness a tragedy unlike anything in its history. The spread, a city in frenzy. What began with one woman soon engulfed the city in a frenzy of unstoppable movement. By August, the dancing plague had spread dramatically. Historical chronicles report that up to 400 people were dancing in the streets, alleys, and public squares of Strasbourg. The city had never seen anything like it. The dancers moved without rhythm or coordination, their movements chaotic and desperate rather than joyful. They appeared unable to control their bodies, as if possessed by some invisible force that commanded them to dance without ceasing. The authorities' initial response, providing spaces and music for the dancers, had backfired terribly. Rather than containing the phenomenon, it seemed to encourage its spread. The sight and sound of the afflicted, combined with the music meant to cure them, appeared to trigger the condition in others. The city council, realizing their mistake, quickly changed tactics. They banned all public music and dancing in the city, hoping to stem the contagion. But it was too late. The plague had taken hold. The physical toll on the dancers was horrific. Many danced for days without stopping, their feet swollen and bleeding, their bodies drenched in sweat. Contemporary accounts describe dancers collapsing from exhaustion, only to rise again and continue their manic movements once they had caught their breath. Some reports claim that up to 15 people died each day at the height of the plague, from heart attacks, strokes, or sheer exhaustion. The streets echoed with the sounds of labored breathing and the thudding of feet on cobblestones. The psychological impact on the city was equally profound. Those not afflicted watched in horror as their friends, neighbors, and family members danced themselves toward death. Parents saw their children seized by the mysterious compulsion. Children watched helplessly as their parents danced until they could stand no more. The city's normal functioning ground to a halt as more and more people succumbed to the dancing mania or were occupied with caring for the afflicted. In desperation, the city authorities tried various measures to address the crisis. They eventually transported many of the dancers to a shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus, a saint believed to have power over nervous disorders. There, priests performed exorcisms and other religious rituals, hoping to cure what many believed was a case of demonic possession or divine punishment. Gradually, over the late summer and early autumn of 1518, the dancing plague began to subside. The number of new cases decreased, and those afflicted slowly recovered, though many were left weakened for life. By winter, the dancing had stopped entirely, leaving the city to make sense of what had occurred. Enhanced eyewitness accounts, voices from the dancing plague. The dancing plague of 1518 was documented by several contemporary witnesses, whose accounts provide us with a vivid and disturbing picture of the events. One of the most valuable sources comes from Paracelsus, the renowned physician who wrote about the incident in the 1530s. Though he wasn't present during the outbreak itself, he gathered first-hand testimonies and provided one of the earliest medical analyses of the phenomenon. According to Paracelsus, the dancing began when Frau Trophia stepped into the street with a distorted and troubling countenance, as if possessed by some spirit not her own. Witnesses described how she danced with extraordinary vigor and in a manner most strange, her movements lacking the coordination and joy of normal dancing. Instead, her dance was characterized by wild leaping, screaming, and contortions of the body that appeared painful to behold. Bystanders reported that her eyes seemed vacant, as if her mind were elsewhere while her body moved of its own accord. The city chronicler of Strasbourg wrote that as more people joined the dancing, the streets became a scene of chaos and suffering. He described dancers crying out for help, their faces twisted in agony, even as their limbs continued to move. Some dancers were reported to have fallen to the ground, foaming at the mouth, only to rise again and resume their terrible dance. The chronicler noted that many appeared to be in a trance-like state, neither fully awake nor asleep, but caught in some terrible middle ground. A local physician named Wendelin Spies documented the physical toll on the dancers. He wrote of feet swollen and bleeding, clothes drenched in sweat, eyes rolling wildly in their sockets. Spies observed that some dancers would occasionally come to their senses briefly, begging for mercy and assistance, only to be seized again by the compulsion to dance. He described how family members would attempt to restrain their loved ones, only to be dragged along by the unnatural strength the afflicted seemed to possess. Religious authorities also left accounts of the phenomenon. A church official named Johannes Geiler described the dancers as appearing possessed by demons. Their bodies moved not by their own will, but by some force from beyond. He noted that many of the afflicted would cry out to Saint Vitus for deliverance, even as they continued to dance. Some witnesses reported hearing the dancers speak in tongues or utter prophecies between their gasps for breath. Perhaps most chilling are the accounts of the dancers themselves, recorded by various officials. Those who survived and could later speak of their experience described feeling an irresistible compulsion, as if their limbs were not their own. One dancer reportedly said it felt as if fire burned within my legs, forcing them to move. Another described music that no one else could hear, compelling them to dance. Many spoke of visions they experienced while dancing, of heaven, of hell, of saints and demons watching their suffering. Enhanced medical treatments, desperate remedies. When confronted with the bizarre spectacle of people dancing uncontrollably in the streets, the authorities in Strasbourg responded with a range of treatments that reflected the medical understanding and beliefs of the time. Their approaches evolved as the plague spread and conventional remedies failed, revealing the desperate measures taken to address this mysterious affliction. The initial response came from the city's physicians, who diagnosed the dancers with hot blood. This was a recognized medical condition in the humoral theory that dominated medieval and Renaissance medicine. According to this theory, the human body contained four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, which needed to remain in balance for good health. The physicians believed that the dancers' blood had become overheated, causing their minds and bodies to lose control. The prescribed treatment for this condition was, paradoxically, more dancing. The physicians reasoned that the afflicted needed to dance out the excess heat in their blood until the fever broke and balance was restored. This approach was based on the medical principle of like cures like, which suggested that symptoms could be alleviated by inducing more of the same. As one contemporary physician noted in his records, the dancing sickness must exhaust itself, as a fire will burn until no fuel remains. To facilitate this treatment, the city council took extraordinary measures. They cleared 2 guild halls and the grain market, creating designated spaces for the dancers. They constructed a wooden stage in one of the city's main squares specifically for the afflicted. Professional musicians were hired to play music, with the hope that structured dancing to actual music might help bring the chaotic movements under control. The council even paid for professional dancers to accompany the afflicted, believing they might help guide the movements into less harmful patterns. When these measures failed to stop the dancing and people began to die from exhaustion, heart attacks, and strokes, the authorities turned to more spiritual remedies. The dancers were taken to the shrine of Saint Vitus, a saint associated with dancing and neurological conditions. Their priests performed exorcisms, believing that demonic possession might be the cause. Holy water was sprinkled on the dancers, prayers were recited, and religious relics were brought into contact with the afflicted. Some accounts mention more unusual treatments. One physician reportedly prescribed immersion in cold water to cool the hot blood. Others attempted bloodletting, a common treatment for many conditions at the time, to release the excess heat. Herbal remedies were administered, including concoctions of valerian root and other plants known for their sedative properties. One chronicler mentions attempts to bind the dancers' limbs with cloth, soaked in various medicinal preparations, hoping to draw out the poisonous humors through the skin. The city council also took preventive measures to stop the spread of the dancing plague. They banned public music and dancing for non-afflicted citizens, fearing it might trigger more cases. They also prohibited the wearing of pointed shoes, which were thought by some to contribute to the condition by allowing evil influences to enter through the feet. Some accounts even mention the burning of specific herbs and woods throughout the city to purify the air of whatever miasma might be causing the strange behavior. Enhanced social and religious context, a society in crisis. To truly understand the dancing plague of 1518, we must delve deeper into the social and religious environment of Strasbourg at that time. The early 16th century was a period of extraordinary hardship and spiritual anxiety throughout Europe, and Strasbourg was no exception. The dancing mania erupted against a backdrop of severe social stress and intense religious fervor that had created perfect conditions for such a phenomenon. In the years leading up to 1518, Strasbourg and the surrounding region had endured a series of catastrophes. Crop failures had been frequent and devastating. The winter of 1517 to 1518 had been particularly harsh, leading to widespread famine. Historical records show that grain prices had soared to unprecedented levels, making bread, the staple food, unaffordable for many. Contemporary accounts describe people resorting to eating weeds, bark, and even clay to stave off hunger. One chronicler wrote of seeing children with bellies swollen from hunger crying in the streets, while their parents lay too weak from starvation to comfort them. Disease followed hunger, as it often does in history. The region had experienced repeated outbreaks of the plague in the preceding decades. Syphilis, a new and terrifying disease at the time, had recently arrived in Europe and was cutting a devastating path through the population. Its symptoms, including neurological effects that could cause jerking movements, may have contributed to the atmosphere of medical fear. Leprosy remained endemic, and those afflicted were forced to live as outcasts. Death was a constant presence, with mortality rates, especially among children, reaching horrific levels. The religious context was equally significant. This was a society saturated with supernatural belief, where the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds was thin and permeable. The Catholic Church dominated every aspect of life, and its teachings emphasized the constant battle between divine and demonic forces for human souls. Saints were believed to have the power both to protect and to punish. Saint Vitus, in particular, was associated with dancing. While he could cure dancing ailments, it was also widely believed that he could curse people with dancing mania if they had offended him. Religious art and sermons of the period constantly reminded people of the consequences of sin. Church walls were adorned with vivid depictions of hell and divine punishment. Priests preached that disasters like famine and plague were God's retribution for human wickedness. One sermon from 1517, preserved in Strasbourg's archives, warned that God shall make you dance in the fires of hell if you do not repent your sinful ways. Such messages, delivered to a population already suffering from hunger and disease, created an atmosphere of intense psychological distress. The dancing plague erupted just 1 year after the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, which Martin Luther had launched in 1517. While Strasbourg was still officially Catholic, religious tensions were rising, adding another layer of anxiety to an already stressed society. Some contemporary accounts explicitly linked the dancing mania to religious upheaval, with one cleric writing that, as the people questioned the true faith, so their bodies questioned their minds' control. Strasbourg itself was undergoing social changes that added to the tension. The city was prosperous compared to the surrounding countryside, creating stark inequalities. Guild conflicts were common, and the urban poor lived in desperate conditions. The influx of rural refugees fleeing famine had strained the city's resources and heightened social tensions. One city councilor wrote of the desperate masses at our gates, bringing with them the stench of death and despair. It was in this context, a perfect storm of physical hardship, psychological stress, and spiritual anxiety, that Frau Trophia stepped into the street and began to dance in July 1518. Her actions, inexplicable on their own, become more comprehensible when viewed against this backdrop of a society pushed to its breaking point. Historical theories, explaining the inexplicable. For 5 centuries, the dancing plague of 1518 has puzzled historians, physicians, and scientists. What could cause hundreds of people to dance uncontrollably until they collapsed from exhaustion or even died? The contemporary explanation was straightforward in the context of 16th century understanding. Supernatural forces were at work. Many believed the dancers were possessed by demons or were being punished by Saint Vitus, the patron saint of dancers. Others thought it was a curse placed on the city by an angry god for the sins of its inhabitants. These explanations made perfect sense in a world where the supernatural was considered an everyday reality. As the centuries passed and scientific understanding advanced, new theories emerged. In the 19th century, the dancing plague was often attributed to mass hysteria, or what was then called epidemic chorea. The theory suggested that extreme psychological distress could manifest in physical symptoms that spread through a population through a kind of social contagion. The dancers weren't faking their symptoms, they genuinely couldn't control their bodies, but the root cause was psychological rather than supernatural. Modern researchers have proposed several more specific explanations. One compelling theory points to ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that can grow on rye and other grains, especially in cold, damp conditions like those that preceded the 1518 outbreak. When consumed, ergot can cause hallucinations, spasms, and convulsions that might resemble frenzied dancing. The alkaloids in ergot are chemically related to LSD, potentially explaining the trance-like state of the dancers. However, ergot poisoning typically causes muscle contractions and seizures rather than the coordinated movements described in historical accounts, making this explanation problematic. Another theory suggests that the dancers were suffering from a psychological condition now known as mass psychogenic illness. Under extreme stress, such as that caused by the famine, disease, and hardship prevalent in Strasbourg in 1518, people can develop physical symptoms with no organic cause. The initial cases might have been individuals with epilepsy or other movement disorders, but as more people witnessed the dancing, the behavior spread through psychological contagion. The dancers weren't consciously choosing to dance. They were experiencing a genuine compulsion brought on by extreme psychological distress. Some historians have proposed cultural explanations, suggesting that the dancing plague was related to the religious ecstatic dances practiced by certain sects, or was a form of stress release in a society where emotional expression was heavily restricted. Others have pointed to the possible role of tarantism, a similar phenomenon in southern Italy, where people believed that dancing was the cure for the bite of a tarantula spider. What makes the dancing plague of 1518 so fascinating is that no single theory fully explains all aspects of the event. It remains one of history's great mysteries, a testament to the complex interplay between mind and body, individual and society, and the profound impact of collective trauma on human behavior. Enhanced similar historical events. Dancing through the ages. The dancing plague of 1518 was extraordinary, but it wasn't unique. Throughout European history, there were multiple episodes of dancing mania and similar mass psychogenic illnesses that swept through communities. These events, spanning several centuries, provide crucial context for understanding the Strasbourg outbreak and reveal fascinating patterns in how collective psychological distress manifests in different historical periods. The earliest well-documented case of dancing mania occurred in 1021 in the German town of Kalbeck. According to chronicles, 18 peasants began dancing around a church on Christmas Eve and couldn't stop for an entire year. While likely exaggerated, this account established the connection between uncontrollable dancing and divine punishment, as the dancers were reportedly cursed for disturbing a religious service. A much larger outbreak occurred in 1374, sweeping through the Rhineland, the Netherlands, Belgium, and northeastern France. Thousands of people took to the streets, dancing wildly until they collapsed from exhaustion. Contemporary accounts describe the dancers screaming, hallucinating, and claiming to see heavenly visions. This outbreak occurred shortly after the Black Death had devastated Europe, suggesting a connection between mass trauma and these bizarre behavioral manifestations. One chronicler wrote that the dancers appeared to have lost all reason, dancing with wild abandon, oblivious to shame or injury, until they fell unconscious to the ground. The 15th century saw several smaller outbreaks across Europe. In 1428, a dancing mania struck the German town of Schaffhausen, and similar events were recorded in Zurich and Strasbourg. These episodes typically began with a small number of individuals and rapidly spread to dozens or hundreds of others. Religious authorities often interpreted these events as cases of demonic possession or divine punishment, while civic leaders struggled to maintain order as the dancing disrupted daily life. Beyond dancing manias, other forms of mass psychogenic illness appeared throughout European history. Particularly notable were the possession epidemics that swept through convents between the 15th and 17th centuries. Nuns would collectively exhibit symptoms including convulsions, speaking in tongues, blasphemous screaming, and bizarre physical contortions. One of the most famous cases occurred in 1634 at the Ursuline convent in Loudun, France, where a group of nuns claimed to be possessed by demons, leading to sensational exorcisms and, ultimately, the execution of a priest accused of witchcraft. Another related phenomenon was the biting mania that spread through German convents in the 15th century. Nuns would fall into trances, scream, convulse, and bite both themselves and others. The mania spread from convent to convent, sometimes affecting entire communities of religious women. Like the dancing plagues, these events occurred during periods of extreme social stress and religious anxiety. Moving beyond Europe, similar phenomena have been documented across cultures and time periods. In Malaysia and Indonesia, periodic outbreaks of running amok involved individuals, usually men, engaging in violent, frenzied attacks before collapsing or committing suicide. In various African cultures, episodes of mass possession have been recorded, with symptoms tailored to local beliefs about spirits and supernatural entities. More recent examples include the laughing epidemic that struck Tanganyika, now Tanzania, in 1962, affecting nearly 1,000 people with uncontrollable fits of laughter lasting up to 16 days. Schools had to be closed as the mysterious condition spread from one village to another. In 1983, the June bug incident in a textile factory in the United States saw workers reporting symptoms including dizziness, nausea, and fainting after believing they had been exposed to insect bites, though no environmental cause was ever found. What connects these diverse events across time and culture is their occurrence during periods of extreme social stress, their rapid spread through communities, and their manifestation in culturally specific forms. The dancing mania of 1518 wasn't an isolated anomaly but part of a recurring pattern in human collective behavior, one that continues to this day, though in forms that reflect our modern anxieties and beliefs.